Amos made his master beg for his life. The fields of Bel Rive still remember it, the night when Mercy died and the earth itself seemed to turn against the men who once ruled it. They called him the Ox, a slave too strong to break and too silent to understand, until the day they took his children and buried his wife beneath the magnolia tree. That was the night something inside him awakened, not rage, but purpose. And when vengeance came, it didn't shout, it whispered. Tonight, we return to the haunted lowlands of Mississippi, where the river carries more than water, it carries memory. This is the story of Amos, the slave who watched his children sold and made his master beg for his life. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed and your notifications are on, because stories like this, stories they tried to bury, must be told. Now, let's return to the summer of 1851, to Bel Rive Plantation, where the roots of power ran deep, and one man learned how to pull them out. The sun rose heavy over Bel Rive Plantation, pressing its heat into the earth until the air itself seemed to ripple. On that August morning of 1851, the auction bell rang across the fields, sharp and metallic, the sound of business. It echoed through the quarters, calling people from their work to witness another transaction of flesh. Amos stood among them, tall and quiet, his skin marked by years of labor. He had learned long ago that silence was armor, and today it was all he had. Before him, the platform had been built from a wooden crate, a space where prices would replace names. Two of his children stood upon it, Samuel, barely 10, and Ruth, 7, while his youngest hid behind a row of barrels clutching a broken toy horse. The buyers arrived in carriages and dust. They spoke in calm tones, their eyes moving over the children with the same practiced calculation they used for livestock. Numbers passed between them like coins. The clerk read aloud their ages, their weight, their health. Each word was a wound. When the gavel came down, 2 lives were separated from his forever. The heat did not break, but something inside Amos did. It was not the kind of breaking that makes a man collapse. It was quiet, measured, the kind that reorders thought. As the crowd dispersed, he stood unmoving, memorizing faces and voices. He watched where the keys hung on the overseer's belt. He counted the horses tied along the fence. Every sound, every distance, every door became a note in a pattern only he could hear. Behind him, the quarters whispered prayers that never reached heaven. Ahead, wagons waited to carry the children away. The clerk shut his ledger and smiled, pleased with his arithmetic. The master adjusted his hat and turned toward the big house, already thinking of profit. But Amos kept watching. His stillness was not defeat, it was study. When the last bell rang and the dust settled, he walked back toward the fields, slow and deliberate. The sky above was a pale, merciless blue. Somewhere a mockingbird sang, and somewhere else the sound of chains rattled in rhythm with the wind. That day, no one noticed the look in Amos's eyes. They should have. It was the kind of look that ends legacies. Bel Rive Plantation stood like a monument to arrogance. The white columns of the main house gleamed against the Mississippi sky, their paint hiding the rot beneath. From a distance it looked noble, a symbol of wealth and permanence. Up close it smelled of sweat, mildew, and fear. The cane fields stretched beyond sight, broken only by the slow crawl of the river and the thin line of cabins where the enslaved slept when the work was done. Everything about Bel Rive whispered order, but it was an order fed by suffering. Colonel Thaddeus Harlan believed himself a man of principle. He kept ledgers with perfect precision, every acre measured, every life accounted for. He once told a guest that the secret to success was understanding that human beings could be managed the same way as crops. If a field failed, he replanted. If a worker faltered, he replaced. His wealth depended on seeing people as inventory, and no arithmetic disturbed him more than loss. When debts pressed against his accounts, he found his profit not in harvest but in human flesh. Children were small, light, and fetched good prices in Natchez. To him, that was simple economics. The overseer, Rufus Kane, shared none of Harlan's sophistication but all of his cruelty. His skin was leathery from sun and whiskey, his hands too familiar with the whip. He enforced discipline not because it maintained order, but because it made him feel alive. He laughed when men flinched, and smiled when women begged. Even the hounds seemed to step aside when he passed. Under Cain's rule, the fields became an orchestra of exhaustion, every cry a note in a song of control. Within the house, life mirrored the fields. The dining table overflowed with sugar and wine that carried the taste of blood. The mirrors gleamed but reflected nothing human. Servants moved in silence through the hallways, their faces carefully blank. The air was heavy with the smell of starch and candle smoke, a mix that could almost hide the decay in the walls. Harlan often boasted that his plantation was self-sustaining, that it fed its own hunger. The truth was simpler and darker. Belle Rive devoured whatever innocence it touched. At night, when the fires dimmed and the moon rose over the river, the fields seemed to hum. Some said it was the wind through the cane, others swore it was the land remembering. Beneath that hum, Amos lay awake in the quarters, staring at the rafters. He understood now that the house on the hill was not a home, it was a mouth. It fed on children, on memory, on anything that dared to love. And someday, that hunger would turn inward, consuming the very man who built it. They called him the Ox. The name had started as mockery and ended as truth. Amos carried the weight of Belle Rive on his back, not just the bales of cotton or the barrels of cane, but the rhythm of survival itself. His shoulders had grown thick beneath the sun, his hands like tools carved from bone, his breath steady as the river. He spoke little, but his silence was not emptiness, it was calculation. Behind the stillness lived a mind that counted more than crops. Every day began before the light. He rose when the whip cracked in the distance, when the air was still cool enough to breathe without tasting ash. The others shuffled toward the fields half awake, but Amos walked with purpose. He remembered where every root rose from the ground, where the fences sagged, where the locks rusted. He noticed the men who carried pistols and those who only pretended to. He memorized the shift of Rufus Cain's boots as they sank into the mud. Each sound, each pattern, each face became a number in his quiet arithmetic. The overseers thought his silence meant obedience. They mistook still water for depthless water. Cain once called him slow to learn, but Amos learned everything. He knew how many steps it took from the barn to the sugar house. He knew which mules could run and which ones could bite. He knew the count of guards who watched the river road at night. It was all stored in his memory, organized like ledgers in a book no one would ever read but him. When the others whispered of escape, Amos listened but said nothing. He had seen too many plans collapse beneath hope. He understood that freedom was not won by running into the dark. It was built piece by piece, the way a bridge was built, quiet and slow until it could bear the weight of crossing. For now, he carried his silence like armor. It made the masters overlook him, made the overseer think of him as an animal, not a man. That mistake was the seed of his power. By midday, when the sun turned the fields into mirrors of heat, Amos moved like a machine, steady and unbroken. His sweat fell into the dirt, joining the memory of generations before him. Every push of the plow, every lift of the bale, every drop of breath was investment in something the masters could not measure. To the others, Amos was strength. To the overseer, he was labor. But inside his quiet, something older and sharper lived. He studied his captors not with hatred but with understanding. He knew how greed blinded them, how pride dulled their senses, how fear hid in the cracks of their confidence. In his silence, he built a map of the plantation, of the men who ruled it, of the weaknesses they did not know they had. When the bell rang at dusk and the workers trudged back to the quarters, Amos's steps left deeper prints in the dirt than anyone else's. The Ox, they called him. But beneath that name lived something waiting, patient as the river before a storm. The kind of patience that, when it finally moved, would move everything. The ground behind the quarters was soft that summer, heavy with rain and sorrow. It had become a place of quiet ritual, where the enslaved buried their dead beneath trees instead of tombstones, because trees remembered longer than stone ever could. Under the wide arms of a magnolia, Amos dug until his hands blistered and bled. Each strike of the shovel against wet earth sounded like a heartbeat fading away. When the hole was deep enough, they brought her Lydia, his wife, the only light that had survived the endless labor of Belle Rive. 3 weeks earlier, fever had taken her, slow and cruel. The kind of sickness that made even the strongest forget what breathing felt like. The preacher spoke softly over her body, his voice trembling between faith and exhaustion. He said she was going to a better place, a kingdom without chains or overseers. The others bowed their heads, murmuring assent, but Amos only stood there, still as the tree that shaded her. He had learned to stop believing in words that came from heaven, when the ones spoken on earth had already condemned them all. He said nothing when the preacher finished. He said nothing when the others drifted away. He stayed long after the lanterns were gone, watching the soil settle, the shape of her grave smoothing beneath the magnolia's roots. The air that night was thick with the hum of insects and the smell of river mud. The moonlight pooled through the branches, silver and soft, touching the ground like a benediction. Amos sat beside the mound, his hands resting on his knees. He thought of Lydia's laughter, the rare sound that once rose above the noise of work and whip. He thought of her hands, the way they braided Ruth's hair, the way they had touched his face the night before their children were sold. Now those hands lay folded, still and cold beneath the earth. The magnolia leaves moved, though the air was still. They rustled like whispers, like something trying to speak through the silence. Amos looked up, listening. He could not understand the words, but he knew what they meant. The world had taken everything from him but memory, and even that would soon be dangerous to carry. Yet in that moment, as the wind stirred the branches above Lydia's grave, he felt something stir within himself, a pulse of purpose, faint but alive. Belle Rive slept, unaware that its soil had just absorbed more than a woman's body. It had taken a promise, buried deep with her, a vow unspoken but heavy as the earth that covered her face. When Amos rose at last, his shadow stretched long across the grave. He touched the bark of the magnolia once, gently, as if sealing a pact. Then he walked back toward the quarters without looking back. The night seemed to follow him, and behind him, the leaves kept whispering. The plantation office smelled of ink, sweat, and tobacco. Its windows were narrow, meant more for guarding than for light, and the air inside was thick with the stillness of calculation. On the wall hung ledgers stacked like scripture, each page a record of human lives converted into profit. Colonel Thaddeus Harlan sat at his desk beneath the mounted head of a stag, the symbol of his dominion, though the only hunting he had ever done was with pen and seal. His quill scratched against the paper with the steady rhythm of habit. He did not see faces or remember names. He saw figures that balanced, columns that obeyed, debts that vanished when the numbers were right. He wrote slowly, carefully, shaping each letter like a monument to control. 2 children, mulatto, male and female, $750 each. The words filled the page with finality, as though the act of writing them erased the sound of crying, the smell of dust, the memory of small hands reaching for their father. Harlan's handwriting was elegant, every line measured, every curve deliberate. He believed that beauty in the record kept ugliness from staining the conscience. When he closed the book, he felt not guilt but satisfaction. Order restored. Account balanced. World intact. Outside, the sound of the wind through the cane fields carried faint echoes of the lives his ink had erased. But Harlan did not hear it. He was already turning the page, moving from sale to debt, from flesh to finance. On the next sheet lay the name Sebastian Cole, written in bolder ink than most. A banker from New Orleans, known for his charm and his merciless precision, Harlan owed him a sum that could ruin any man less prideful than himself. There was a note in the margin, written in haste. Final payment required before winter. Collateral acceptable. Harlan tapped his pen against the desk, reading that line twice. His lips curved into something between amusement and defiance. He did not believe in consequences, only transactions. The ledger had always been his shield. As long as numbers obeyed him, the world could not touch him. But the ink on that page would not stay silent forever. Every stroke of the quill, every figure he so neatly balanced, carried the weight of something living and restless beneath it. The ledger of flesh, as the enslaved called it among themselves, was more than paper. It was a graveyard bound in leather. Each name written within it waited for the day when the arithmetic of cruelty would turn against its author. By the time Harlan closed the book and sealed it with wax, the sun had set behind the fields. The room darkened except for the flicker of a single candle. He did not notice how the flame bent toward the open ledger, as though drawn to the ink itself. He did not see the shadow on the floor lengthen, stretching like a hand toward the desk. He only saw the neatness of his work, the perfection of his numbers, and the comfort of believing that what was written could never rise again. Rufus Cain treated cruelty like sport. To him, pain was not punishment but entertainment, a private game played on the backs of men who could not fight back. The other overseers measured work by the field's yield, but Cain measured his worth by how much he could make another man break. He had learned that fear was easier to maintain than respect, and he nurtured it the way some men nurtured gardens. His voice could slice through the fields like a whip, and his laughter always followed, dry and sharp as the crack of it. Amos, the ox, became his favorite target. Cain invented ways to test him. He cut the water supply short at midday, just when the heat turned breath into fire. He extended the work hours by a bell's toll, claiming new quotas or imaginary delays. Sometimes he ordered Amos to lift loads no one else could manage, just to watch the great man bend beneath the weight. When Amos steadied himself and kept moving, Cain laughed louder. He mistook patience for weakness. He thought silence meant surrender. What he never understood was that every act of cruelty left behind a trace, a pattern. Amos began to read like scripture. Each delay, each punishment, each insult revealed something hidden about the way Belle Rive worked. When the guards changed posts, Cain became lazier. When shipments went to Natchez, he left earlier, returning with mud on his boots from the southern road. The locks on the grain house were replaced every few months, always by the same blacksmith from the next parish. Amos memorized the shape of the keys on Cain's belt and the sound they made when he walked. He noticed the times when the dogs were fed, when the patrols passed the quarters, when the night watch drank themselves numb behind the stables. Nothing escaped him. Cain's cruelty was constant, but its rhythm was predictable, and in predictability there was knowledge. Amos began to understand that the plantation's power rested on habit, not strength. Men like Cain survived only because their victims had learned to expect pain. If expectation could be broken, so could the chain. At night, when the others slept, Amos replayed the days in his head like a book of figures. Every insult became an entry. Every lash became a line drawn in ink only he could see. He was building something beneath the surface of his silence, a structure of observation that would one day bear the weight of vengeance. Cain never noticed the way Amos watched him, never sensed that the same patience he mocked was turning into calculation. He only saw a laborer bending to his will, unaware that what he was really shaping was a man who was learning him, memorizing him, mastering him. The overseer's game was simple: hurt, control, repeat. But Amos was playing another game entirely, one that moved in quiet increments. The day would come when the laughter would stop, when the rules would reverse, and Rufus Cain would learn that the ox had been keeping score all along. Sleep came to Amos like a thief, sudden and uneasy. That night the air hung thick and warm, the sound of cicadas folding into the pulse of the swamp beyond the fields. When the dream came, it did not creep softly as dreams sometimes do. It arrived whole, as if the memory had never left. He saw his son Samuel standing in an alley, older than when he was taken, the face leaner but unmistakably his. The boy's clothes were torn, his feet bare, and in his hand he held a candle that refused to go out though the wind bent its flame. Behind him were the outlines of buildings, a city lit by lanterns that burned low and mean. Samuel turned as if searching for something, and for a heartbeat their eyes met. Then the candle flickered, and the dream dissolved into smoke. Amos woke before dawn, his chest damp with sweat, the air still carrying the ghost of that smoke. The sound of the fields waking around him was familiar, but it no longer felt the same. The dream had planted something sharp in him, a direction, a purpose that went beyond endurance. Until that moment, his life had been measured in survival. Now it found a new measure in distance, the distance between him and his lost children. He rose quietly, before the first bell, and stood outside the quarters beneath a sky that had yet to lighten. The stars above Belle Rive were the same stars that hung over Natchez, over the ports of New Orleans, over every road where a child might be sold. Somewhere, under that same sky, Samuel was alive. Amos could feel it as surely as he could feel the soil under his bare feet. And if Samuel lived, perhaps Ruth did too. Amos began to plan in the same way. He had always worked slow, deliberate, exact. He no longer watched Cain merely to endure him. Now he studied him as a problem to be solved. He counted the time between the overseer's patrols, the number of steps to the river road, the gaps in the night guard's drunken routine. He learned which dogs could be bribed with scraps, which ones could not. His silence deepened, but within it grew motion, thought, design. Freedom, to Amos, was no longer an idea spoken in whispers. It was a map unfolding in his mind, drawn from memory and dream alike. He would not flee into the wild for the sake of running. He would move with purpose, like a tide that recedes only to gather strength before it returns. By sunrise, the fields called him back to labor, and he obeyed. His hands lifted the same tools, his shoulders bore the same weight, but something unseen had shifted. The dream lingered, guiding him like a compass pointing north. Each swing of the hoe, each step through the rows, was a rehearsal for departure. Belle Rive still owned his body, but his mind had already begun to leave. The first spark came without warning, a hiss of dry lint catching flame in the gin house, small and almost invisible against the noise of the machinery. But by the time anyone noticed, the fire had already found its meal. It ran through the rafters like a living thing, hungry and quick, leaping from beam to beam until the air itself seemed to burn. Smoke poured into the twilight, black and thick, rising above the cane fields like a signal to heaven that hell had arrived on earth. Men shouted and scattered. Buckets were passed from the well to the blaze in a frantic chain, but the fire laughed at the effort. The gin house fed it too well: cotton, oil, old wood soaked in years of sweat and dust. Within minutes the roof glowed red, then collapsed with a sound that silenced everything else. 3 men were still inside, their cries swallowed by the roar. Amos did not think. He moved. His body, shaped by years of toil, carried him straight into the heart of the fire while others hesitated. Heat tore at his skin, smoke clawed his throat, but he pressed forward through the wreckage, finding the trapped men beneath a fallen beam. He lifted it as if it were nothing more than another day's burden. One by one, he dragged them out into the open air. When the roof fell completely, Amos stood between the survivors and the inferno. His skin streaked with soot, his breath harsh but steady. By dawn, what remained of the gin house was a smoking skeleton. The fields shimmered with ash. Colonel Harlan arrived from the big house, his boots sinking into mud blackened by ruin. He surveyed the damage with a face that betrayed calculation, not grief. Yet when he looked at Amos standing among the smoldering debris, something flickered behind his eyes. For the first time he saw not a tool, but a man who had preserved his investment through sheer will. Harlan spoke softly, almost with respect, and that night Amos was summoned to the stables. The master granted him new responsibilities: supervision over repairs, access to tools, and the keys that opened the locked sheds. He called it reward. Amos understood it as opportunity. From that day forward, no one questioned when he walked near the storehouse or lingered by the wagons. The keys jingled at his side like a promise. The overseer grumbled but obeyed the order to give him space. Belle Rive healed from the fire, but something new had begun to smolder beneath its calm. Amos had seen what destruction looked like when it began small, a single spark, dismissed until it devoured everything. Now he carried that knowledge inside him, quiet and glowing, like an ember buried in ash. The master believed he had elevated a faithful servant. What he had truly done was hand that servant the means to open every lock between him and the life he intended to reclaim. The morning they left for Natchez broke heavy with mist, the kind that swallowed distance and made every sound seem older than it was. Bellrive still slept when the wagon creaked to life, its wheels biting into the soft earth of the road. Colonel Harlan had sent Rufus Kane to deliver a shipment of processed cotton to the docks, and Amos was ordered to drive. To Kane, it was another errand, another chance to remind Amos of his place. To Amos, it was something else entirely. Natchez was where the roads converged, where ships came from every corner of the South, and where lives bought and sold on paper became strangers on the river. If there was anywhere his children might have been taken, it was there. The trip took most of the day. The road wound between cypress groves and fields of low, green growth, where the soil glistened with last night's rain. Kane talked endlessly at first, stories about fights and women, about debts collected and promises broken. Amos listened without listening, his attention fixed on the world around him. He marked every fork in the road, every milepost leaning under the weight of time. He counted the bridges and the distance between them, filing away each measure like a verse from Scripture. By midday, they reached the edge of Natchez Landing, where the scent of tar, salt, and river mud filled the air. Barges crowded the docks like floating coffins, and men shouted from every direction, some selling, some pleading, some pretending not to hear. The town moved to a rhythm of profit. Iron rings were fixed to posts near the warehouses, and wooden signs listed prices for things that should never have been measured in coin. Amos had seen markets before, but the size of Natchez struck him like a blow. It was a city built on human weight, a place where every cry had an echo that money could silence. While Kane argued with the broker over prices, Amos unloaded the cotton bales, each one heavier than it looked. Sweat ran down his back, stinging the scars that had never fully healed. When he turned toward the street, his gaze caught something he was not prepared for: a boy sweeping dust in front of a slave broker's office. His clothes were worn thin, his shoes too small, but it was not the rags that held Amos still. It was the eyes. The same deep brown that had looked up at him years ago from a cabin floor, the same shape Lydia used to trace with her fingers when the night was kind. For a long moment, the noise of the market vanished. The air between them seemed to tighten, fragile as glass. Amos could not move, could not breathe. The boy lifted his head, sensing the stare, and their eyes met. Then the broker barked an order, and the boy turned away, disappearing inside the doorway. When Kane called for him, Amos forced himself back to work, but the image burned into his thoughts like the after-image of lightning. That evening, after the cargo was delivered and Kane drank himself into dullness at a tavern, Amos slipped away toward the docks. The air was colder now, the wind heavy with the smell of rain and iron. The office where he had seen the boy stood empty, the shutters closed, the broom leaning against the wall as if it had been dropped mid-task. He walked the street twice, then 3 times, searching every shadow, every face, every alley where a child might have gone. But the boy was gone. Amos stood beneath a street lamp that flickered against the fog, the river whispering beyond the levee. Somewhere in that darkness, ships waited to leave at dawn, carrying their cargo toward New Orleans, toward Havana, toward lives that would never be found again. He thought of Samuel's face, of Ruth's small hands, of Lydia's grave beneath the magnolia tree. For a moment, he felt the weight of it all press against him like the night itself. But then, through the grief, came clarity. The sight of that boy had not broken him, it had confirmed something he had always known. His children were out there, living or lost, caught in the machinery of a world that called itself civilized. He could not pray to heaven, for heaven had remained silent too long. But he could remember. He could plan. When Kane staggered out from the tavern and ordered him back to the wagon, Amos obeyed without a word. As they left the town behind, the lights of Natchez faded into a blur. The road stretched ahead, winding through darkness toward the plantation. In the silence, Amos felt the ache of loss harden into resolve. He had come to the edge of the river and found not answers, but direction. The road to Natchez had taken him far from Belle Rive, but in truth, it had carried him closer to what he sought. Somewhere beyond that river, the pieces of his life waited to be found, and he intended to find them even if he had to burn the world that had stolen them from him. The evening air inside Colonel Harlan's study felt thick and stale, like the breath of something that had lived too long behind closed doors. The room was lined with books that no one read, trophies from hunts Harlan never made, and ledgers that mattered more to him than scripture. A single oil lamp glowed on the desk, its light bending across papers that smelled of smoke. Harlan had left in a hurry that morning to attend a meeting in Baton Rouge, and for once, the study stood unguarded. The door was unlocked, the silence complete. For Amos, that silence was invitation enough. He had entered with the quiet surety of someone who understood the rhythm of danger. Every creak of the floorboard was a note he already knew. He had been inside before, cleaning or delivering, never staying long enough to look closely. But now his eyes lingered on the shelves, on the framed maps, on the objects that told the story of a man who mistook ownership for power. The smell of burnt paper drew him toward the hearth. Inside the cold ashes, something caught the light, a corner of parchment, curled but not consumed. He reached in carefully, brushing away the soot until the words emerged. The handwriting was familiar, though not Harlan's. It bore the elegant loops and flourishes of a man used to signing other people's fates. The name at the top made his pulse slow. Sebastian Cole. He had heard it once before, murmured between the field hands who carried gossip like seeds in the wind. Cole was a banker from New Orleans, a man who financed men like Harlan when their greed outgrew their means. The letter began with formality, then drifted into the language of debt and demand. Cole reminded Harlan of an outstanding balance, a shipment that had yet to be reconciled, and the promise of interest that would not forgive delay. The tone was polite, but beneath it ran a quiet threat, the kind that moved money faster than fear. Amos turned the page, his eyes catching on a list that chilled him more than the night air seeping through the shutters. It was a record of property transfers, written in the same indifferent ink Harlan used for crops and tools. But these were not bales of cotton or crates of tobacco. They were names, 27 of them. Men, women, and children. Next to each was a note of value and condition. He read until his vision blurred. Near the bottom, 2 words stopped him cold. Samuel. Ruth. Next to them, a single word written with finality. Delivered. The world seemed to tilt around him. The sound of the clock in the corner grew louder, slower, marking each second like a hammer against his ribs. He traced the names with his finger, as if touching the ink could somehow bridge the distance between the paper and the lives it described. Delivered. It was the word slave traders used when a shipment reached its buyer. It was the word a father should never have to see beside his children's names. At the bottom of the letter, Cole had written one last line. Final payment due before year's end. The ink there was darker, pressed harder into the page, as if the pen itself had bitten. Amos folded the letter and slipped it into his coat before the fire's embers could claim it. He knew the risk of taking it, but leaving it behind felt like a second burial. As he stepped out of the study, the plantation lay quiet under the weight of night. The fields shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and the magnolia leaves stirred, though no wind passed. Somewhere, in the darkness, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Amos walked slowly back toward the quarters, the paper warm against his chest. The letter had not given him hope. It had given him direction. Now he knew that his children's names lived in the ledgers of men who traded in souls, that their fates had been written in debt and delivered like freight. Harlan believed his secrets were buried in fire, but Amos carried them now, alive and waiting. The paper crackled softly as he breathed, like the whisper of a match just before it catches. What he held was more than proof, it was prophecy. The year would end, and with it, something in Belle Rive would burn again. Not by accident this time, but by design. The swamps began where Belle Reve ended, a shifting border of mud, mist, and shadow that the white men feared more than they feared rebellion. It was a place where the land breathed, where the air itself seemed alive and watchful. The trees stood like ancient sentinels, their roots knotted above the water, and their branches heavy with moss that swayed without wind. No one from the plantation ventured far into it. They said the swamp swallowed those who tried. Amos knew that was not entirely true. The swamp did not swallow. It chose. He found Ezra on a night when the fog hung low enough to erase the horizon. The old man seemed to rise out of the water itself, dark-skinned and wiry, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes the color of tarnished brass. He had been a whisper among the quarters for as long as Amos could remember. The escaped slave who never left, the ghost who lived where no hound dared to track. But Ezra was no ghost. He was flesh, older than the trees, carrying a stillness that made the forest listen. Ezra had fled Belle Rive 30 years earlier, back when Harlan's father still ruled the fields. The swamp had become his kingdom. He knew its passages like scripture, every sinkhole and stream, every root that hid solid ground beneath the water. He had survived by turning the land itself into shelter. When Amos found him, he was living in a hollow beneath a fallen cypress, surrounded by jars, herbs, and bones carved into tools. The air there smelled of smoke and something sweetly rotten. Amos came seeking knowledge, not comfort. He told Ezra only what was necessary, that he had lost children to the trade and meant to find them. The old man listened without surprise, as though he had already known. Then he began to teach. He taught Amos how to read the swamp not with his eyes, but with his skin. How to tell direction by the taste of the air. How to move without sound. Where to step so the water would not betray a ripple. He showed him the tunnels of dry earth that lay hidden beneath the roots, passages dug long ago by those who had fled the plantations and never returned. Some led to the river, others to places where the marsh met the road. They were narrow, airless, and safe only for those who had learned to trust the dark. But what Ezra taught most carefully was about the poison. It grew beneath the cypress roots, in a cluster of pale vines that glowed faintly when the moonlight touched them. Ground fine and mixed with water, it could fell a man without pain. In small doses it mimicked fever, in large doses it stilled the breath. The white men called it death vine. Ezra called it judgment. Amos listened, memorizing every word. He learned how much to use, how to disguise the taste, how long it took to work. Ezra made him promise it would not be wasted. Poison, he said, was not for revenge but for correction. It was for those who broke the world and believed themselves untouchable. Weeks passed, and the swamp became another kind of home to Amos. He would slip away after dark, vanish into the mist, and return before dawn with mud on his boots and a quiet he had never known before. The plantation's noise, the clatter, the cruelty, the orders shouted from horseback faded beyond the trees. In the swamp, there was only patience. When Amos left one night, Ezra pressed a small pouch into his hand, filled with dried leaves that smelled faintly of copper and rain. The old man said nothing, only nodded once, as if passing a torch. The swamp had given Amos its secret, and with it, its blessing. As he walked back toward Belle Rive, the mist parted around him like a curtain. The fields glimmered faintly in the moonlight, the big house still and silent in the distance. Amos felt the pouch against his chest, warm through the fabric of his shirt. Beneath the magnolia tree, Lydia's grave waited in the dark. Beyond the horizon, his children's names still lived in another man's ledger. Between them now stood knowledge and the quiet promise of reckoning. Change came to Belle Rive in whispers, not in thunder. It began with things so small they escaped notice. A blade dulled sooner than it should have. A wagon axle cracked on the road to Natchez. A key went missing and turned up days later in the mud behind the storehouse. Each event, taken alone, meant nothing. But together they formed a pattern, a rhythm that pulsed beneath the plantation's surface like a hidden drum, and at the center of that rhythm was Amos. Months had passed since the night he met Ezra in the swamp, and the lessons he carried from those dark waters had become more than knowledge. They had become strategy. Amos no longer thought like a laborer. He thought like someone studying a system from within, waiting for the precise point where it could break. He spoke little, yet his silence had changed. The other men began to watch him, to follow his cues without realizing it. When Amos slowed his work, the field seemed to slow with him. When he paused at the well, others found reasons to linger. A kind of quiet coordination grew between them, invisible to those who ruled. The first real blow came when the grinding mill failed. The main gear splintered overnight, halting production for nearly a week. Harlan raged, blaming Cain for negligence. Cain blamed the men for sabotage, and the men said nothing. The truth was buried in the hands of Amos, who had studied the mill's workings until he knew where the strain would fall. He had weakened one wooden pin, just one, and let time do the rest. From then on, the pattern deepened. Barrels leaked. Nails rusted faster than they should. Shipments to Natchez arrived short by a fraction that no one could trace. The overseer's whip came down harder with every incident, but each strike only forged more resolve. Fear had always been Bellrive's engine, but now it began to turn inward. Cain stopped sleeping soundly. He patrolled at night, pistol drawn, muttering to himself. He began to see rebellion in every shadow. Harlan, proud and blind, mistook the unrest for carelessness. He could not imagine that men who spoke softly could think sharply. Amos understood that power did not collapse all at once. It rotted from within, like wood left too long in the rain. He made sure the decay spread slowly, so that no one could see where it began. He told no one of his plans outright. He didn't need to. A glance, a pause, a quiet word by the well was enough. The others started mimicking the accidents. Tools slipped from hands, ropes frayed, barrels cracked on delivery. Even the women who worked the house played their part, delaying meals or misplacing items until the rhythm of plantation life lost its precision. Harlan responded with fury, instituting double shifts and punishing the innocent in place of the guilty. Yet the more he tried to tighten control, the looser it became. The men learned how to hide defiance beneath obedience. They bowed when he passed, but their eyes no longer lowered. The plantation ran as it always had, yet something unseen had shifted. At night, Amos would walk to the edge of the fields where the earth turned to swamp. The frogs called. The air smelled of cypress and decay, and in that stillness he could feel the weight of what he had begun. This was not rebellion for glory. It was erosion, slow and sure, the kind that left no sound until the whole structure gave way. The overseer's paranoia grew until it infected the quarters. He accused men of plotting, punished them without reason, and in doing so, proved Amos's unspoken point that fear could no longer control what it could not understand. Harlan saw the cost mounting, and began to suspect even Cain. Their alliance fractured quietly. Two tyrants bound by mistrust. Amos watched all this unfold from behind his steady expression. The ox, they still called him, the man of strength and silence. But inside, his thoughts moved with precision. Every act of cruelty, every order shouted from the veranda, was another piece in his plan. He no longer waited for freedom to arrive from the outside. He was building it from within, piece by piece, through patience and pressure. The night he finally smiled, no one saw it. The moonlight caught his face for only a second, but it was enough to reveal the truth. The ox was no longer simply enduring, he was leading. And Bellrive, though no one yet realized it, was already beginning to crumble from the inside. The summer air at Bellrive had grown restless, heavy with the scent of drought and desperation. The fields no longer sang with the rhythm of work but murmured with unease. The master's temper had soured, and his fortune, once spoken of in proud tones, began to feel like a rumor. Even the birds seemed to sense the change, circling lower over the plantation as if waiting for something to die. Colonel Thaddeus Harlan sat at the center of it all, his pride rotting faster than his crops. The letter from New Orleans had arrived 3 days earlier, written in fine ink and sharper words. Sebastian Cole was coming. The banker had waited long enough for his payment, and patience was not a virtue he traded in. Harlan read that letter until the edges tore from his grip. The numbers no longer made sense to him, not because he lacked intelligence, but because they had begun to turn against him. The same arithmetic that once brought him power now spelled his ruin. When the carriage arrived, its wheels cut through the dust like the edge of a blade. Cole stepped out, dressed in black linen, immaculate despite the heat. Two men followed, accountants or enforcers, it hardly mattered which. They carried ledgers under their arms and the weight of authority in their silence. The big house, which had once been Harlan's symbol of victory, now felt smaller in their presence. Cole walked through its doors as though he already owned it. In the shadows outside, Amos stood near the veranda steps, his hands resting against the railing as if by chance. He had been repairing the shutters earlier, and no one thought to send him away. That suited him. He had learned that the most dangerous knowledge was often gained by appearing invisible. Inside, the voices carried clearly through the half-open windows. Cole spoke with the precision of a man who never repeated himself. The debt, he said, was due in full. The final payment could not be delayed. Harlan protested, his voice hoarse with pride. The markets had been poor. The fire at the gin house had set him back. The next harvest would settle everything. Cole listened without expression. When the excuses ended, he simply said, "Collateral." There was a pause then, the kind that reveals more than words ever could. Harlan's pride cracked audibly in that silence. He asked what kind of collateral the banker meant, though he already knew. Cole replied with one word that drained the color from his face. Property. Amos could almost hear the tremor that followed. Papers shuffled, chairs scraped. Harlan spoke again, quieter this time, trying to sound composed. 3 field hands and 1 houseman. The words came out slow, deliberate, and final. Amos recognized each name before the last one reached his ears, his own. From the shadows, he felt the truth of it settle over him like heat before a storm. He was currency now, a number in the same ledger that had recorded his children's sale. Cole's men began writing, marking down measurements and estimated worth as if tallying crates of goods. Amos's body, his years of labor, his silence all reduced to value. Yet while they measured, he was measuring too. Cole agreed to the exchange. 6 more months of grace in return for 4 human lives. When the papers were signed, he shook Harlan's hand with the politeness of a man closing a business deal. Amos watched their silhouettes through the window, the master who sold him and the banker who bought him, 2 men confident that their signatures could dictate fate. Neither noticed the figure standing still beneath the magnolia tree, his face unreadable in the dimming light. That night, the plantation was quieter than usual. The men in the quarters felt the shift without knowing why. The dogs barked once and fell silent. In the big house, Harlan drank himself numb, telling himself that debt had demanded sacrifice and that he remained in control. But the truth was simpler and far crueler. He had just placed a price on the man who would one day decide the value of his own life. Amos lay awake long after the others slept, staring through the cracks in the roof at the faint glow of the stars. He thought of the letter he had stolen, of Samuel and Ruth marked as delivered, of Ezra's poison hidden in his pocket, and now of his own name written in a banker's book. The numbers were aligning, just not in the way Harlan intended. The debt that weighed on the master was no longer just financial. It had become something older, heavier, and far more precise. It was blood calling for balance. And in the silence of that night, Amos began to calculate what payment would finally make the account whole. The whipping tree stood behind the stables, tall and pale, its bark polished smooth by years of suffering. Every plantation had one, but Belle Rive's was different. Its roots spread deep into the clay, drinking from a well of pain so old it seemed part of the earth itself. The overseers said the tree grew faster than others, that its leaves stayed green even in drought. Some whispered that it fed on something more than rain. That morning began like any other, the air already thick with heat before the sun climbed above the cane fields. The workers moved in silence, the rhythm of their labor broken only by the sound of Cain's whip cutting the air. He was in one of his moods, angry without reason, searching for weakness. The young girl he caught near the well had spilled water on the ground, and that was enough to draw his fury. He struck her before she could speak, the leather curling against her shoulder. When Amos stepped forward, it was instinct, not defiance. He did not raise a hand or speak a word, only moved between them. But that was enough. Cain's eyes turned cold. There was something in them that fed on the sight of resistance, even in silence. He shouted for the others to bring the rope. Within minutes, the workers gathered in a half-circle around the tree. No one dared meet Amos's eyes. To intervene was death. To look away was survival. The rope coiled around his wrists, rough against his skin. He didn't struggle. The branches above him swayed softly, as if the tree itself remembered. Cain announced 50 lashes, each one to remind every soul on Bel Rive who commanded fear. The first crack split the air like thunder. The sound carried across the fields, reaching even the big house where Harlan sat at his desk pretending not to hear. Blood followed by the third strike, sweat by the fifth. By the 20th, the air reeked of iron. The men watching clenched their fists but kept their faces blank. The girl who had spilled the water wept soundlessly. Amos did not make a sound. He stood like a pillar carved from the same wood that bound him, his back torn but unbroken. Each lash that fell seemed to strike the ground harder than his flesh, sending echoes through the soil. The silence unnerved Cain more than any scream could have. By the 40th lash, his arm trembled. He swung harder, desperate to draw a reaction, to prove that pain still ruled the flesh. When it ended, Cain wiped his brow and leaned close, panting, the whip dangling from his hand. Amos raised his head slowly, his face streaked with blood and dust. His lips parted, and the words came out low, almost gentle. "I'll remember this." Cain laughed, a dry, brittle sound, as if to dismiss what he had heard. But then Amos smiled. It was not madness, nor submission. It was a quiet promise, one so calm it made the laughter die in Cain's throat. For a moment, the overseer felt something he could not name, a chill that did not belong to the heat of the fields. They cut Amos down and left him there in the dirt. The crowd dispersed, the day resumed, and Bel Rive pretended to forget. But the tree remembered. The soil drank deep, and the air around it held the weight of something waiting. That night Cain drank heavily, trying to drown the image that refused to leave him, the blood, the smile, the silence that swallowed his laughter. The whip hung beside his bed like a shadow. Outside, the wind moved through the branches of the magnolia and the cypress, carrying with it a single whisper that only the guilty could hear. The ox had bled, but he had not broken. And in that stillness, something in Bel Rive shifted again, as if the land itself had begun to count the days until the debt was due. The night the storm broke over Bel Rive, the air felt alive with electricity, as if the heavens themselves had grown impatient. Rain came down in sheets, turning the fields into rivers of mud. Thunder rolled across the plantation like cannon fire, masking every sound that did not belong to nature. Beneath that noise, Amos moved. The storm was his ally. For months he had waited, memorizing schedules, measuring shadows, collecting keys. Now, when the world above him raged, he slipped through the cracks of it unseen. He made his way past the stables, through the wet grass, to the outer road that led toward the river. The dogs did not bark. Perhaps they recognized something in his scent, something that did not fear them. The rain blurred his outline and washed away his footprints. The keys at his belt, stolen from Cain's quarters, made no sound. Behind him, Bel Rive faded into darkness. Ahead, the swamp opened like a mouth, and he entered without hesitation. The journey to Natchez took 2 days of hunger and exhaustion, guided by memory and instinct. He moved mostly at night, sleeping in ditches during daylight, drinking from puddles when the streams ran too thick with silt. When he reached the outskirts of the city, the storm had already passed, leaving behind a world washed clean but heavy, with the smell of wet earth and decay. Natchez was alive with trade wagons creaking, ships moored along the riverfront, men shouting as they moved goods from hand to hand. It was a city built on the buying and selling of everything that could be owned, including people. Amos walked among them unseen, just another laborer with eyes that looked down. He had come chasing rumors whispered through the quarters. A boy, light-skinned, working for a trader named Cole. The name cut him every time he heard it. Cole, the man who had written his children's names in ink beside the word delivered. He found the boy on the second evening. The sun had begun to set, painting the sky in rust and ash. Outside a brick warehouse marked with Cole's insignia, a young man was sweeping the steps. His movements were quick, practiced, the body of someone who worked without rest. When he turned slightly, the light caught his face. The eyes were the same deep brown, steady, too old for their years. Samuel. His son. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Amos froze, afraid that even a breath might shatter the vision. The boy looked stronger now, taller, his shoulders squared by labor. But when the broom slipped from his hand, Amos saw the faint tremor that betrayed recognition. It was only then that he noticed the scars across Samuel's back, pale and jagged like lightning frozen in flesh. Their reunion was brief, a heartbeat stretched thin by years of separation. Words were not needed. The silence between them carried everything, the loss, the rage, the fragile hope. But that fragile moment broke as quickly as it came. The door behind Samuel swung open. Men stepped out, carrying ledgers and pistols. Cole's men. They saw Amos before he could move. The chase was short. The odds were never his. They struck him down in the street, the butt of a rifle catching his shoulder, the chains snapping around his wrists before he could rise. Samuel shouted, but the sound was drowned by the river wind and the laughter of those who had caught their prize. By the time dawn returned, Amos was in the back of a wagon headed south, his wrists raw, his vision blurred with exhaustion. Through the slats he saw Natchez fade behind him, the city shrinking into mist, his son's figure swallowed by distance. He closed his eyes, tasting blood and salt, but his mind stayed sharp. The storm had given him freedom, and the city had taken it back, but neither could take what he had seen. Samuel was alive. When Belle Rive rose again on the horizon, glinting under the pale light of morning, Amos did not feel defeat. The chains were heavy, but they were only iron. He had carried heavier burdens before. In his silence, something colder than pain began to take shape, something stronger than rage. He had found proof that his blood still walked the earth. Now all that remained was to make the earth remember the price it had taken. The morning of the spectacle began with a cruel kind of beauty. The sky was clear and blue, the air thick with the smell of sugarcane and ash. Belle Rive had not looked so peaceful in months, but beneath that calm lay a tension that coiled through every worker's body like a second heartbeat. Word had spread quickly that the master was to make an example of Amos. The men were told to gather near the courtyard. The women were warned to keep their children close. By noon, the sun stood high, glaring down on a scene arranged like theater. Colonel Thaddeus Harlan sat on the veranda, dressed in his finest linen suit. His face carried the composure of a man performing righteousness. Behind him, the overseer Rufus Kane stood with folded arms, his expression twisted in satisfaction. The air buzzed with insects and anticipation. The only sound louder than the cicadas was the clink of Amos's chains as he was dragged forward into the light. He looked half dead. The journey from Natchez had left his body battered and thin, his back still marked by the whip, his wrists raw from iron, but his eyes were alive, steady and unreadable. When he stopped before the veranda, he did not bow. He simply stood, and that simple act drew a hush across the yard. Even the birds seemed to stop their calls. Harlan rose slowly, his movements deliberate, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to shaping fear. He told the crowd that rebellion had come too close, that order must be restored, but that mercy was what separated a master from a beast. He called it the privilege of civilization. He said the world would know that Belle Rive did not rule through cruelty, but through control. Then, with a faint smile, He declared that Amos would not die. The words rippled through the gathering. Cain's mouth tightened. He had wanted blood. The slaves looked to one another, confused, uncertain whether mercy meant salvation or something worse. Harlan continued, announcing that Amos would be confined for his crimes, kept alive to remember the price of defiance. It was a performance dressed as justice, a master's theater meant to reassure his audience that the system still worked, that mercy could only flow downward. The guards pulled Amos away and led him toward the old smokehouse near the edge of the property, now converted into a makeshift cell. The crowd dispersed slowly, murmuring. Some called it a blessing, others a curse. But in Harlan's decision, something irreversible had already been set in motion. Mercy had not saved him. It had doomed him. Inside the dim cell, Amos sat against the wall, the air thick with the scent of mold and smoke. The door locked behind him with a hollow echo. Outside, Harlan returned to his veranda, pouring himself a drink and congratulating his own restraint. He believed he had reasserted dominion, that he had bent fate to his will. But fate had only turned its gaze toward him. By sparing Amos, Harlan had given him time to think, to heal, to plan. The confinement was meant to break him, yet it became a crucible instead. In the silence of those days, Amos replayed every lash, every insult, every face. He counted the moments as precisely as he once counted the weight of cotton bales. When the rain came, he tasted it through the cracks in the roof and remembered the swamp's lessons. When the night fell, he felt the pulse of the earth beneath the floorboards and heard the whisper of Lydia's magnolia leaves outside. To Harlan, mercy was a performance of power. To Amos, it was a mistake, a small crack in a wall that time and patience would widen. The master had chosen to spare a man he thought broken. What he had really done was cage a storm. And in the stillness of that cell, with chains around his wrists and blood dried on his back, Amos began to see his future clearly. The day would come when the same crowd that watched his humiliation would witness something far greater, the undoing of the man who mistook mercy for mastery. The cell where Amos was confined had no window, only a slit in the wall where the air slipped through like a reluctant visitor. Days and nights blended into one another, marked only by the sound of footsteps outside and the slow creak of wood expanding in the humidity. Hunger gnawed at him at first, but it was not the kind of hunger that weakened. It sharpened. The body grew lean, but the mind grew precise. In that darkness, Amos learned that silence could be a kind of weapon, as patient as time itself. When the hours grew long, he thought of Ezra and the swamp, of the nights when the old man's voice floated low over the sound of frogs and rushing water. Ezra had spoken of the poison that slept beneath the cypress roots, hidden in clusters of vines that glowed faintly in the moonlight. He called it the earth's quiet revenge. A single root, crushed and mixed with water, could make a man feverish by dawn. A second dose, hidden in wine or brandy, would stop the heart so gently it left the face serene. It killed without spectacle. It erased the boundary between nature and justice. Amos had not thought of the poison since the night he left the swamp, but now the memory rose from the depths of his mind like a shadow surfacing through still water. He could see Ezra's hands showing him how to slice the vine, how to drain the milky sap and let it dry into flakes that dissolved on the tongue. He remembered the warning too much and the body convulsed, too little and the mind stayed awake inside a dying shell. But in the right measure, it was perfect, swift, silent, absolute. From the slit in the wall, Amos could smell rain. The storm had passed, but the scent of wet earth carried the memory of the swamp. He closed his eyes and imagined the path that led there, the twisting trails that only Ezra knew. He pictured the roots slick with mud, the clusters of nightshade hidden under leaves. He knew the men who brought food to his cell. He knew the servants who refilled the master's glass each night. He knew patience could bridge the distance between dream and act. When Harlan visited on the third week, it was not out of concern but performance. The colonel stood outside the cell door, his tone condescending, his words wrapped in the pretense of benevolence. He told Amos that his mercy still stood, that obedience could earn forgiveness. Amos did not answer. He only lifted his eyes enough for Harlan to see them. The silence made the master uneasy. He left quickly, muttering something about discipline. But Amos had seen the small silver flask at his belt, the one he filled nightly from a decanter of brandy in his study. The image of it fixed itself in his mind like a spark waiting for dry kindling. Each night afterward, he built the plan piece by piece. The guards who delivered his food were careless, accustomed to their own superiority. The back door to the stables was unlatched after dusk. The swamp was less than a mile away, and in that swamp, under roots as old as sin, waited what he needed. He would not run this time. He would return with something no whip or gun could stop. The thought steadied him. It gave shape to his confinement. What Harlan believed to be punishment had become preparation. Amos counted the days not as a prisoner, but as a craftsman measuring his work. The time would come soon when the roots of Belle Reve and the roots of the swamp would meet, one feeding on life, the other on justice. And when that moment arrived, the poison beneath the cypress would no longer sleep. It would find its way into the veins of the man who mistook mercy for safety. In the dark, Amos smiled to himself. The swamp had given him its secret once before. Now, in the silence of his cell, it whispered again. It told him that every root carries its own reckoning, and that every man who builds power on the suffering of others eventually drinks from the soil he poisoned. The house at Belle Rive had not glowed so brightly in years. Lanterns hung from the porch, the silver polished to a mirror shine, the scent of roasted meat drifting through every corridor. Colonel Thaddeus Harlan was in his element, striding between his guests like a man reborn. The long shadow of debt had finally lifted, and he was eager to let the world see that the master of Belle Rive still stood untarnished. His creditors were paid, his fields promised a record yield, and his pride, bruised but intact, demanded a celebration. The annual harvest supper would serve not only as a feast, but as proof that order had returned. The great hall was set with white linen and crystal, the air buzzing with the low murmur of planters and merchants, their wives fanning themselves against the heat of too many bodies and too much ambition. Laughter rolled beneath the chandelier, but beneath it lingered a strain of unease. The overseer, Rufus Kane, drank faster than the others, his smile fixed but brittle. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing the scars of a man haunted by what he pretended not to fear. Across the room, Amos stood silently in the corner, dressed in a clean servant's coat that did nothing to hide the strength in his shoulders. He poured drinks, cleared plates, and moved with the calm precision of someone who had accepted his place, or so they thought. Harlan had insisted Amos be brought back from confinement weeks earlier. He had told Kane that a servant like him was too valuable to waste. He called it magnanimity, the generosity of a master who knew when to temper punishment with forgiveness. The truth was simpler. Harlan wanted to parade his mercy as proof of his control. He believed Amos's submission was complete. The ox had been tamed. As the evening deepened, the music grew louder. Harlan made a toast, standing tall at the head of the table, his face flushed with pride and wine. He spoke of providence, of labor, of the divine right of men who tamed wild land. He raised his glass to Kane, to his guests, and finally to himself. Around him, the table erupted in applause. Amos stood behind his chair, brandy bottle in hand, his expression unreadable. When Harlan waved for more, Amos stepped forward. He filled the glass slowly, the amber liquid catching the light like molten gold. One glass for the master, one for the overseer, one untouched, resting quietly on the tray. The scent of the brandy filled the air, sweet and sharp. The men laughed, their conversation returning to debts, politics, and the new railway rumored to pass through Natchez. None of them noticed how steady Amos's hand was, or how his gaze lingered on the rim of the glass before he stepped back into the shadow. Kane drank first, swallowing greedily. Harlan followed, savoring the flavor with a satisfied sigh. The untouched glass sat on the edge of the tray, the only silent witness in a room full of noise. Amos moved about the hall as the laughter swelled, refilling plates, pouring wine, disappearing and reappearing like a shadow among men too proud to see him. An hour passed before the first cough broke through the merriment. Kane tried to speak but found his voice failing. His hand trembled as he reached for the table, his glass tipping over, spilling dark liquid across the linen. The laughter faltered. Harlan looked up sharply, confusion flickering in his eyes. Then the same cough took him, low and strangled, as the color drained from his face. The guests rose, shouting for help, for air, for reason. Amos stood still. His expression never changed. The chaos unfolded around him, a storm of panic and disbelief. He could smell the faint trace of foxglove beneath the brandy, the scent only he would recognize. He turned toward the doorway as Cain collapsed, the whip hand that once held power now twitching against the floorboards. Harlan tried to speak, to demand explanation, but the words never came. Outside, the wind shifted, the lanterns flickered. The great house of Belle Reve, so proud and bright, seemed to lean into its own silence. Amos walked through the hall without hurry, the empty tray balanced on his palm. Behind him, the music had stopped. The guests huddled in confusion, whispering the words sickness, not yet daring to think of poison. He stepped out onto the veranda, where the night was cool and the magnolia trees stood still in the dark. The moonlight spilled across the fields, silver and calm. Somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called, its lonely cry cutting through the quiet. Amos drew a slow breath, tasting the damp air. Justice had no sound, no shout, no cry. It arrived quietly, as natural as the turning of the river, as steady as the roots that hid their poison beneath the earth. The night air hung thick and heavy over Belle Reve, as if the earth itself had stopped to listen. The celebration was long over, the laughter smothered beneath a silence that pulsed with dread. The guests had fled in confusion, their carriages vanishing into the dark road beyond the oaks. Inside the great house, only the dying light of oil lamps remained, flickering against the walls like restless spirits. The smell of brandy lingered in the air, sweet, sharp, and tainted by something unseen. Rufus Cain was the first to fall, his body convulsed near the parlor door, limbs jerking as though pulled by invisible strings. He tried to speak, but only foam and broken breath came from his mouth. His eyes bulged, desperate, unfocused. He clawed at the floor, trying to reach the decanter, the promise of more drink, more life. The veins in his neck stood out like cords ready to snap. Every gasp was a plea that no one answered. Harlan staggered a few feet away, one hand gripping the edge of the dining table, the other pressed against his chest. Sweat poured down his face, soaking through his fine linen shirt. The proud master who had once spoken of power and mercy now trembled like a man made of paper in the rain. He looked to Amos as if the sight of him could still command obedience, as if the world might yet obey his voice. Amos stood in the doorway, the lamp behind him turning his shadow long and unbroken across the floor. His face was calm, unreadable, his eyes reflecting the light so perfectly they seemed to belong to something beyond flesh. He watched as Cain writhed, as Harlan's knees gave way, as the room that had once hosted laughter and arrogance filled only with the rasp of dying breath. Harlan's voice broke through the silence at last, faint but frantic. He gasped Amos's name, each syllable a struggle. He begged for help, his tone shifting from command to desperation. He promised forgiveness, freedom, anything that might draw mercy from the man he had chained. He reached out with trembling fingers, his nails dragging across the floorboards, leaving trails in the dust. Amos stepped closer, the wooden planks creaking under his feet. He crouched beside the man who had once called himself master. For a long moment, he said nothing. He could hear the labored wheezing, see the pale tremor in Harlan's lips. The colonel's hand grasped at his leg, a touch that once would have meant ownership, now reduced to begging. The irony was almost holy. When Amos finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost tender. "Now you remember their names?" The words hung in the air, soft and lethal. Harlan's eyes widened, the sound of recognition caught in his throat. He tried to answer, but the breath left him before the words could form. His body went still, his hand falling limp against the boards. Across the room, Rufus Kane shuddered once more and then lay silent, his final exhale lost beneath the sound of rain beginning to fall outside. The lamplight flickered and dimmed, its glow sliding over Amos's face as he rose. The house was utterly quiet now, save for the slow dripping of rain from the veranda. He stood in the center of the grand hall, the same place where he had poured brandy hours before, and looked down at the two men who had ruled his world. Their power had ended not with a rebellion, not with fire or blood, but with silence. He felt no triumph, no joy, only a steady calm. The world had balanced itself. The soil beneath Belle Rive had claimed what it was owed. Amos turned away from the bodies, from the ruin of a house built on pain, and walked into the night. The rain fell harder now, washing over the porch, carrying the scent of magnolia and wet earth. Each drop struck the ground like the ticking of a clock counting down the end of an era. By dawn, Belle Rive would be quiet again. The slaves would wake to a world without a master, and the sun would rise over fields that no longer belonged to anyone. The ox had remembered every lash, every cruelty, every name lost to the ledger. And now, so had the land. The room was collapsing into stillness, the kind that comes only after a storm has spent its final breath. The candles had burned low, their wax pooling across the tablecloth, the scent of smoke and brandy thick enough to choke. Harlan lay on the floorboards beside the overturned chair, his body trembling in fits, his breath coming shallow and wet. Death was not fast with him. It clung stubbornly, as if the land itself wanted to hear what he still had to say. Amos stood over him, the light of the lamp painting his face in gold and shadow. He did not move to help. He simply watched, his chest rising steady, his eyes fixed on the man who had once held his life between the tips of his fingers. Kane was already gone, sprawled in the dirt outside, his body stiffening beneath the rain. The world had narrowed to this room two men, one dying, one silent, and a truth that had waited too long to be spoken. Harlan's hand twitched, his fingers dragging across the wood, searching for something to hold. His voice came low, broken by coughs that left stains of red on his lips. He called Amos's name, not as a command, but as a plea. The sound of it was strange, fragile, human. Amos said nothing, but the stillness between them invited confession. It was as if the dying man felt the weight of a soul he had long buried pressing against his chest, demanding release before the light went out. With great effort, Harlan turned his face toward Amos. His eyes, once cold and certain, were clouded with the kind of fear that comes from seeing too late what one has done. He spoke slowly, each word carved from pain. He said the children were not sold for debt. He had lied to himself, to his books, to everyone who lived under his rule. The ledger had been a cover for shame, not necessity. Harlan told him that Lydia Amos's wife, the woman buried beneath the magnolia tree, had once been his. Before Amos married her, before she was allowed even the illusion of choice, she had been forced into Harlan's bed. The plantation's power had always hidden such things, but this secret had burned deeper than most. When Lydia gave birth to Ruth, her second child, Harlan saw his own features staring back at him. The same eyes, the same mouth. The resemblance was undeniable. To him, that truth was poison. It threatened everything he had built, every illusion of order and superiority he lived by. The child was his own blood, born from a woman he considered property, fathered by a man he considered beneath him, and so he had done what he believed would erase the sin. He sold them both, Ruth and Samuel, one to a trader in Natchez, one to a broker in New Orleans. The transaction was clean, the papers signed. The record buried beneath a line of figures that read, "Debt paid." The confession hung in the air like smoke, too thick to breathe. Harlan's voice grew weaker, the words fading to a whisper. He said he had told himself it was mercy, that selling them spared them the cruelty of living reminders. But in truth, it was cowardice. It was fear dressed as righteousness. He had watched Lydia fade after that day, her spirit wither until fever took what grief had already claimed. Amos's expression did not change. His hands stayed still at his sides, though his heart thundered behind his ribs. The revelation did not surprise him. Somewhere deep within, he had always known there was something more to the cruelty, something personal that had made his suffering deliberate. Now he knew why Harlan had kept him close, why he had mocked him as intelligent but never trusted him with freedom. The master had been punishing the reflection of his own sin. Harlan's voice broke one last time. He begged for forgiveness, his words slurred by the weight of approaching death. He said Amos had every right to hate him, but begged him not to let the curse of his blood live on through vengeance. His lips trembled with a final desperate prayer that dissolved before it reached heaven. Then his breath hitched once, and he went still. Amos stood over him for a long time, the lamp sputtering between them. He did not answer. There were no words that could touch what had just been revealed. The house was quiet except for the steady patter of rain against the windows and the low groan of the timbers settling. He looked down at Harlan's body not as a man looks upon an enemy, but as one might look upon the soil after fire. What was left now was ash and silence. Amos turned away, his steps slow and deliberate. Behind him, the last of the candlelight guttered out. The master's confession lingered in the darkness, a secret at last stripped bare. And for the first time in Belle Rive's long history, the truth no longer belonged to the man who spoke it, but to the one who had endured it. The dawn that followed was not a sunrise but a reckoning. The sky over Belle Rive hung gray and swollen, heavy with clouds that refused to break. Smoke from the previous night's candles still clung to the air, mingling with the sharp scent of decay and the sweet perfume of the magnolia blossoms that grew wild behind the quarters. The plantation was silent. No overseer's whistle split the morning, no commands echoed across the fields. For the first time in memory, the land itself seemed to hold its breath. Amos worked alone. He had sent no one to fetch tools, called no one to help. The spade he carried was old, its handle worn smooth from years of digging trenches for men who had died building the wealth of others. Now it would serve a different purpose. Behind the magnolia tree, where Lydia slept beneath roots that had grown thick with her memory, he began to dig. The ground was soft from the night's rain, the soil dark and rich. Every thrust of the shovel struck like a heartbeat, steady and sure. The bodies of Rufus Kane and Colonel Harlan lay where they had fallen, stripped of the power that had once made men bow and tremble. Their faces were gray now, their fine clothes stained with earth and failure. Amos dragged them one at a time across the yard, their limbs heavy and unresisting. The first to fall into the pit was Kane. The overseer's whip still hung from his belt, a cruel relic that would rot with him. Harlan followed, his fine boots sinking into the mud that had once carried his pride. The two men lay side by side, indistinguishable in death. When the last spadeful of dirt covered them, Amos paused. The wind moved through the magnolia leaves, carrying a sound that was not quite words but not silence either. The tree's roots stretched deep into the same earth that now held them all, the wife, the master, the overseer. For a long while, he stared at the ground, his breath slow and even. There was no triumph in his face, no gloating in his posture. Only calm. The calm of a man who had finally reached the edge of what revenge could offer. As evening fell, a soft light began to rise from the direction of the swamp. It was faint at first, like mist catching moonlight, but it grew until the water itself seemed to glow from within. The cypress stood like watchmen, their roots mirrored in the shining surface. Fireflies gathered thick as stars, weaving through the branches as though drawn by something ancient and unseen. The air smelled of wet earth and memory. It was as if the land had woken to witness what had been done. Amos stood at the edge of the clearing, the faint glow reflecting in his eyes. The stillness of the swamp spoke to him not in words, but in feeling, a deep vibration that moved through the soil and into his bones. He thought of Lydia, of the songs she used to hum when the nights were kind, of the children whose names had been carved into the ledger of cruelty. He thought of the hands that had built this world, only to be buried beneath it. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost part of the wind. Debt paid. The words were not for the dead men behind him, nor for the heavens above. They were for the ground itself, the witness, the judge, the only thing that never lied. The swamp answered with a ripple of light across the water, and for an instant, Amos thought he saw movement within it. Figures, faint and shimmering, rising from the mist. They were not frightening. They were familiar. Faces he had loved, voices he had lost. Lydia's smile among them, soft and forgiving. He stood there until the light began to fade, until the fireflies drifted higher and the swamp returned to shadow. Then he turned back toward the quarters, his steps slow but unburdened. The night wrapped around him like a cloak, cool and silent. Behind him, the magnolia tree swayed gently in the breeze, its roots cradling both cruelty and love, its blossoms opening to the moon as if in offering. For the first time, Belle Rive was quiet in a way that felt like peace. The land had taken what it was owed. The ghosts could rest. And Amos, at last, could breathe without the weight of another man's name upon him. Weeks passed before Amos saw the world beyond Belle Rive again. The days after the burial had blurred into one another, a long silence filled with the rhythm of rebuilding. The fields stood empty, the cabins quiet. Word had spread slowly that the master was dead, that the overseer's whip had gone still. The people whispered his name with awe and fear, uncertain if he was man or spirit. But Amos did not stay to explain. When the sun rose one morning, he gathered what little he owned, a shovel, a knife, and a strip of cloth from Lydia's old dress, and walked away without a sound. The road to Natchez had not changed, though it felt heavier beneath his feet. The same trees arched above the path, their branches bent like ribs over a spine of dirt and stone. He passed fields where men still bent their backs to the cotton, overseers shouting from horseback as if the world had never turned. No one stopped him. The country was filled with travelers, now runaways, soldiers, traders, refugees. To the white men, he was just another shadow passing through, another freed soul with nowhere left to go. When he reached Natchez, the city was swollen with noise and smoke. The riverfront bustled with wagons and boats, shouts echoing off the warehouses. The same slave markets still stood, though the flags above them had changed. Freedom had come to some in words, but not yet in truth. Men were still being sold. Only now it was under different names, contracts, apprenticeships, debts. Amos walked through it all like a ghost returning to his own grave. He went first to the office of a trader he remembered, a man who had once dealt with Sebastian Cole. The place smelled of sweat and ink. The clerk behind the counter looked up and shrugged when Amos asked about Samuel Fairholme. The boy had been sold north, he said, 2 weeks before Cole's death. The ledger showed no destination, just a name and a price, a transaction sealed and forgotten. Amos thanked him, though the word came out empty. He stepped back into the street, the sound of wagons and river bells filling the silence that followed. He imagined Samuel older now, stronger, perhaps still alive somewhere among strangers. But he knew what the world did to children who were bought and sold. Hope was a fragile thing, easily broken by reality. He searched for Ruth next. Her name had been spoken by a washerwoman near the docks, a woman who remembered a girl with light eyes and a cough that would not stop. The fever camps outside Vicksburg had taken many that year. They burned the bodies to keep the sickness from spreading. No graves, no markers. Only ashes swept into the river when the wind shifted. By the time he reached the levee, the sun was low, turning the water to copper. The river stretched wide and endless, flowing with a calm that felt almost cruel. It looked like freedom, but Amos knew better. Every current was a story of loss, the bodies thrown from ships, the mothers who leapt after their children, the men who had drowned, chasing a shore that never came closer. The river did not forget, it only carried. He stood there for hours, the sound of the water filling the hollow space inside him. He thought of Lydia's grave beneath the magnolia, of Samuel somewhere north, of Ruth gone to dust. He thought of the men he had buried in the same soil they once ruled. The river shimmered in the dying light, beautiful and merciless. When darkness came, he knelt and touched the water. It was cold and alive, slipping through his fingers like time itself. He whispered their names, not loud, not for the world to hear, but for the river to carry. Lydia, Samuel, Ruth. Each name disappeared into the current, taken, but never lost. As he rose, the wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of magnolia blossoms from miles away. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace, not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer ruled him. The river would keep their memory. The land had taken its payment. The rest of his life would belong to the road ahead, wherever it led. He turned from the levee and began to walk toward the horizon, where the night met the water. Behind him, the Mississippi rolled on, silent and eternal, carrying with it the ghosts of 1,000 names and one man's vow never to forget them. Years passed, and the story of Belle Rive faded into something between history and myth. The plantation itself stood in ruin. The great house burned to its bones after a storm of uncertain cause. Some said lightning struck the roof one summer night. Others swore they saw a figure walking away from the flames with a shovel in his hand and no fear in his eyes. Whatever the truth, by the time the sun rose, the house that had once ruled over hundreds was nothing more than blackened timber and ash. The fields lay wild, the fences broken, and the river mist rolled over the land like a burial shroud. But stories have a way of surviving even when their authors vanish. In the years that followed, travelers passing through Mississippi began to whisper about a man they called the Ox. Some said he had gone north, crossing into the lands where papers promised freedom but hearts did not. There, they claimed, he worked for the railroads or in the docks, quiet and strong, never staying long enough for anyone to learn his name. Others swore he still lived in the swamps near the old Belle Rive grounds, a ghost made flesh who guided runaways through the mud and cypress, teaching them how to read the stars, how to move without sound, how to disappear. The ones who believed in spirits said he never left at all. They said the earth had taken him back, the same way it had taken the master and the overseer, binding them together in its endless memory. They told of nights when the magnolia trees glowed faintly, their blossoms opening wide even without moonlight, and the air turned heavy with the scent of rain and ash. If you stood close enough, they said, you could hear the roots humming beneath your feet. And if the wind shifted just right, it carried a whisper that rose from the soil itself, a name drawn out slowly, syllable by syllable, like the earth remembering a wound it had finally learned to heal. Children born long after the war would walk past the ruins, daring each other to step inside. They said you could still see footprints burned into the floor where the master had fallen, and if you left water by the magnolia at night, it would be gone by morning. The elders told them it was not ghosts but gratitude, the land drinking what it was once denied. Those who had known Amos never agreed on how his story ended. Some insisted he crossed the Mississippi and vanished into the wilderness beyond, where no slave catchers or soldiers would ever find him. Others swore they saw him years later in the back of a church in Natchez, his hair white, his hands folded, his face lit by the glow of a single candle. But all agreed on one thing. Wherever he went, he was not the same man who had labored beneath another man's whip. The ox was gone. In his place was something quieter, stronger, and freer than any name could hold. And yet, for those who dared to visit Belle Rive after dark, the story never quite stayed buried. They said that when the wind moved through the magnolia trees, it carried more than sound. It carried breath. It carried memory. It carried the faint murmur of a man's voice whispering a name once spoken in fear, now spoken in judgment slowly, softly, until the river itself seemed to answer back. The Mississippi rolled on, carrying the ghosts of those who built and broke and bled along its shores. And somewhere, beyond the reach of maps or time, Amos walked with them not as a slave, not as the ox, but as the man who had turned silence into legend.